Welcome to this Believe weighted blanket tutorial. In this video, I'll show you how to sew a weighted blanket based on the Ted Lasso Believe sign. A quick note, every part of this has been self-drafted by myself with no pattern testers, so if you find yourself confused at any step along the way, please don't hesitate to reach out and I will do my best to help. Moving right along, here's what you'll need to make one of these blankets for a finished size of around 65 inches by 42 inches. You'll need 2 yards by width of fabric, typically around 40 to 44 inches for the background and the backing. You'll need ½ yard of fabric for the sign, somewhere around ¼ yard for the letters. You'll need 12 pounds of these poly pellets. I like them that even though they're plastic, they're big enough to not slip through the seams, like glass beads might, and they also allow the blanket to be washable. Steam-a-seam 2 is how you get the letters to adhere to the sign fabric. You don't need to buy a whole box like I have. You can get it cut by the yard at your local quilt shop. You'll need a sewing machine. Unfortunately, you can't make a weighted blanket by hand because the pellets could fall out of the seams. And then standard stuff. You'll need an iron, ironing board. I use my water bottle instead of filling my iron with water. Quilting ruler. Walking foot is really helpful. Those little clips are really helpful in general. You'll need pins, a Sharpie for tracing the letters. For needles, I use the Microtex. They're really sharp, which is helpful for sewing through the steam-a-seam. For threads, I typically use this Aurifil thread. It's cotton though, and so for the weighted blanket, I tend to use this yellow poly thread from So Fine. And it just seems to help the weight a little bit better. You'll need a fabric ruler, seam ripper, fabric scissors, rotary cutter, and some quilting gloves are not necessary, but they help tremendously in helping your grip move the fabric through your machine. We're going to start first with making the letters. Take the cardstock template letters and place them back side up onto the side of the steam-a-seam that has the yellow grid. So each of the letters should look backwards to you. Now I make a ton of these, so I try and cram the letters as closely together as I can to minimize the amount of waste of my steam-a-seam. But if you bought, for instance, a 3-foot cut of steam-a-seam and you have plenty of space, feel free to spread them out. One thing to note here that I did not actually follow in this example, if your letter fabric that you're using is directional, you want your letters to all be traced onto the steam-a-seam in their proper orientation. In this example, you can see the V is perpendicular to the rest of the letters because I was trying to minimize the waste, and you'll see in a little bit why I shouldn't have done that. Okay, now you'll use your Sharpie, trace each letter. You will want to mark each letter with its position within the word, so from numbers 1 through 7. And I always write the word back on it as well. And that's just a reminder to myself when I'm looking at the steam-a-seam, I should see the word back, and that's a reminder that I need to be adhering it to the back of the letter fabric, or the wrong side. The wrong side of the fabric should be facing up. So here's what that should look like. In this case, I was making 2 sets of letters all at once. Now put your letter fabric right side down because the steam-a-seam with the backwards letters gets adhered to the back of the letter fabric, so when you eventually cut out the letters, they'll be the proper direction from the front of the letter fabric. First, make sure that the steam-a-seam will fit on your fabric. Okay, so the steam-a-seam is made up of 3 layers: the yellow grid on the front, the white backing parchment paper, and the adhesive between the two. So your letters are written on the yellow grid, and you can pull off the white backing now, but you need to make sure that you're leaving the adhesive on the yellow grid side. Sometimes it tries to come off with the backing. Use your hands to smooth out any bubbles. Here's where I'll recommend that you watch a steam-a-seam tutorial video for more info on how to use it, and that you practice with scrap pieces first to see what works best for you. I'm pressing very, very lightly here so that when I cut the letters out, the steam-a-seam stays on the fabric. I found that if I just hand press to the fabric, it doesn't stay as well when cutting out the thin pieces of the letters. But if you press too long or too hard, it'll permanently adhere to the yellow grid paper, which is not what we want. Now we'll go ahead and cut out the letters. I use a combination of my rotary cutter and scissors. I usually use the rotary cutter for as many flat lines as I can, although here in the video I'm using scissors. But really it's whatever you feel most comfortable with. So here are all the letters, and you can see on the back side that we still have the yellow grid steam paper, and you can see by that one that we now know that B is the first letter of the word. It is much easier than you'd expect to pull a Jamie Tart and completely misspell the word, by the way. So you could remember what Fall Out Boy told us, and that the best part of believe is the lie, or you could do yourself a solid and just number the letters. Especially with the 3 E's that can also trip you up. You can put them very easily in the wrong spot. Okay, so remember a few minutes ago I said that if your letter fabric has a directional pattern to make sure that your letters are oriented in the same direction? Here is why. You can see here that the lined pattern on this pink fabric is going vertical on the I rather than horizontal like all the other letters. Now, maybe that's not a level of detail you care about, but maybe it is, and it has certainly been a lessons learned for me. Here's a set of blue letters, and below them are the scrap pieces of steam backed fabric. I usually keep those and make the tape pieces out of them. Those are like from the insides of the E's and the inside of the B and whatnot. Now on to making the sign. First, as with all the fabric, make sure you've pre-washed it and then press the creases out before doing any cutting. Then cut the fabric to 18 inches wide by width of fabric, typically 40 inches or so, but make it at least 36 inches. Now place the letters, still with the yellow grid backing paper on, onto the sign fabric. Align the letters as straight as you can. It'll probably take some measuring and some adjustment. I typically put the I right in the center and then build the word out from there using the 24-inch quilting ruler to make sure it's relatively straight. When you've got the letters pretty much where you want them, start taking off the yellow grid paper of the steam. Make sure the adhesive stays on the fabric and doesn't come off with the backing paper. Place the letter back in its spot on the sign fabric. But don't worry if it's not perfect, as the beauty of steam is it's not permanent until you hot press it with steam. So you'll still be able to adjust the letters even after you've placed them on the sign. Continue with all the letters. Once I get all the letters down, I like to take a photo from above, as it's easier to see if the letters need adjustment. Here I can see that it's not actually straight. The middle letters are all a little bit too high. So we go back and adjust the letters again until it's good enough. I'm pretty happy with that, so now we will move on to steaming the steam letters. Again, I'd highly recommend trying out the steam on some scrap fabric and or watching tutorials on it. But the gist is that the adhesive is activated by steam, hence the name. I personally don't like keeping water in my iron, so I use a small spray bottle and I spray down the letters individually like that. If you keep water in your iron, you can use the steam button on your iron as you're pressing to release the steam. Using the iron on high, if you're using all 100% cotton fabrics, press down on the letter for 15 seconds, which is how long it takes for the steam to adhere. You can actually hear my 15-second alarm going off in the background of the video. If the letters are bigger than what you can cover with your iron, like mine are in this video, then the 15 seconds applies to each section of the letter that can be covered by your iron at any one time. When you remove the iron, there should be no more water left in the fabric and the letter will be permanently adhered to the sign. While the steam is a permanent adhesion, I also top stitch the letters. both because it will help prevent fraying and I just think it looks better. Here's a quick look at my machine settings. Now, my machine is actually only a straight stitch, so I can't do a zigzag with this machine at all. You are welcome to use a zigzag around the outline of your letters if you'd prefer. I use a 2.8 millimeter straight stitch. You'll also want your needle to stop in the down position if your machine has that setting. That will help a lot when you are rounding the corners of your letters. Here I'm actually using a blue polyester thread, but cotton thread will work just as well. I'm only using poly because it's the blue thread that I have. There's two ways that you can start and stop the top stitching for each letter. The first is what I do here. It's you can back stitch a few stitches before starting and it will lock in the end of your thread. That's what I do in the video. That's how I made the first, 20 blankets or so. However, depending on the color of the thread versus the color of the fabric, sometimes these back stitches can be kind of noticeable. So in the last few months, I've actually started leaving my thread tails, tying them off, and burying them on the back side of the fabric. I don't do that in this video, so if you aren't sure what that means, just reach out. And just know it's an option that provides a cleaner finish, but it takes a bit more time and effort. One other note I just wanted to make is that this video is sped up. Take your time when top stitching the letters. You definitely don't want to be going this fast, or how fast I guess it appears that I'm sewing here in the video. So you can see here I am back stitching again to lock in the end of my thread here. Here's a close-up of the top stitching. You can see right there where the back stitches are. You can also see my eternal struggle with getting the fabric colors to show up properly on my phone camera. Keep top stitching all the letters until they're complete. Now for the public service announcement that if you have cats, you will also need a lint roller, or 5. And once your ironing board is clean again, go ahead and press out any wrinkles or remaining creases from your sign. I'm spraying the sign lightly with my water bottle to help get it as smooth as possible. Now we're going to press down the raw edges to give the sign a clean look when we applicate it onto the background fabric. Fold down each edge of the sign fabric by about 1/4 inch to 1/2 inch. It's kind of up to you, just try and keep it consistent the whole way around. Fold in the corners as well so there are no raw edges exposed at all. As you can see here, I have left the selvage on my sign. Again, this is almost exactly a width of fabric, I think. I don't think I trimmed this at all. If you want yours to be smaller, you can. Now that the letters are on, you can use your best judgment of however big you want the sign to actually be. My cats were very interested and continue to be interested in every sewing activity, so you will see them pop up quite a bit from this point forward in the video. Now we're moving into preparing the background fabric, and this is what the sign is going to adhere to. Once again, make sure you've pre-washed your fabric and then press out the creases. I also wanted to mention that part of the beauty of making these yourself is you can customize the size to fit whatever you need. As I mentioned in the beginning, I typically use 2 full yards by width of fabric, which is typically, again, around 40 to 44 inches, for the background on the front and for the backing. This will give you a final blanket size of somewhere around 65 inches long by about 42 inches wide. You can increase or decrease any of those fabric dimensions to suit either the person you're making it for or the fabric that you have on hand. The method of construction is extremely flexible and can basically fit whatever you need. Once your background fabric is pressed, you need to square it. There's all sorts of methods out there for squaring fabric, so I won't get into too much detail here. But if you're using a good quality fabric from like your local quilt shop rather than a Joann's or a thrift shop or something like that, typically the selvages will be straight enough for our purposes. So what I do is I fold the fabric in half so that it is 1 yard wide by the width of fabric, and I line the selvages and I square off the raw edges. Then I cut the selvages, then the final side of raw edges. Don't worry if you leave a little bit of selvage on like I do here, because the blanket uses a self-binding technique that will hide all of the edges within the seam allowance. Fold the fabric in half again so that it's now 1 yard by a half width of fabric. So it should basically be folded into 1/4 of the blanket size. Do a quick and light press at the center edges. This is going to give you an easy way to center the sign on the background fabric. This method works for me after a lot of trial and error, but you are welcome to use whatever methods that you'd like to center your sign. Use the crease you just made in the center of the background fabric to align the sign. The I in the believe should be just about the middle. It's up to you how you like to orient the sign. I usually make mine crooked with the B side lower and the E side higher. I usually measure the distances between the center line of the background fabric to each corner of the sign to make sure that it's relatively balanced. Something I don't show in this video, because frankly I forgot to do it on this one, is to baste your sign fabric to the background fabric. Spray basting is my favorite. It is nice and quick and easy, but you can also use safety pins or thread basting if you prefer. At this point, I've swapped out my bobbin and thread to a yellow to match the sign fabric, and I top stitch the sign onto the background fabric. Make sure all of the corners and raw edges are hidden while you're sewing. I backstitch to start and stop my stitching for the sign. I don't think there's much of a point in burying your threads here, unless there's a huge color difference between your thread and your sign, but for the most part it should be okay. If you have a walking foot, that would be helpful to use, although I'm not using one in this video. And once again, if your machine has the setting, keep the needle in the down position so that when you turn corners, it'll keep your fabric in place. Other than that, just top stitch all the way around. And here is a closer look at the top stitching of the sign. Next, we're going to make the tape pieces. So I've got pieces of the blue letter tape that have the steam seam on the back. These are kind of the cast-offs, the waste from cutting out the letters. And I kind of cut the edges, as you can see on the video, just to give it a little bit more of an organic ripped tape feel, I suppose. You could also do this with the black fabric. I just never have black fabric, so it's always been easiest for me just to use the discards from the letters. In general, you want your tape pieces to be about 1.5 inches thick and anywhere from 3 to 4 inches long. Once you've got the tape pieces aligned where you want them, take off the yellow grid backing paper and adhere them to the sign. So I take mine and I go straight over portions of the sign and portions of the background, and then spray it down and press it for the 15 seconds so that it will be permanently adhered. Then I go ahead and swap back in my blue thread and I top stitch each of these pieces as well. At this point, when you finish the pieces of tape, you will have finished the quilt top, and we're about 50% done with the whole project. There will be a part 2 coming that will show how to attach the quilt top to the backing fabric and how to fill it with beads, so stay tuned for that.